Hello and welcome back, Outlaws. Today we're tackling burnout head on. I'm Shayla.
I'm Kate. So why talk about burnout? Because for some, like Shayla and our guest today, it took hitting a wall to realise that life and work as usual simply weren't sustainable. So burnout isn't a badge of honour. It's painful, it's debilitating, and it's often invisible to the people suffering through it. And we meet so many who feel they have no choice but to keep pushing on.
So that's why we invited Sally Clarke on today. She's a researcher, a best-selling author, and a global expert on burnout prevention. And she brings evidence-based insights and practical tools to help us recognise the warning signs, recover with intention, and redesign work so it fuels us instead of depleting us. From teaching yoga on 5 continents to advising Fortune 500 teams, Sally knows exactly how to spot burnout early and really make work so that it fuels you instead of burning you out. So welcome, Sally. Let's dive in. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me, Kate and Shayla. Lovely to be here with you discussing this important topic.
Yeah,
So nice to have you here.
We're really excited to have you. When you have a look at your website and your books, obviously you're an incredible expert on burnout. Tell us about how you got into it.
It certainly wasn't my intention at the outset. So I studied law in Adelaide and then sort of fled the scene, moved to London and then ended up in Amsterdam and randomly got a job offer at one of the top tier firms in Europe. And so sort of felt like this is an opportunity I can't pass up and started work as a corporate finance lawyer. And within 6 months was absolutely snowed under, working 70 to 80-hour weeks, really struggling with an excessive workload, but very much attached to the prestige that was sort of surrounded that role. It really felt like my business card basically said success. And so I struggled through for a few years, grappling with increasing amounts of stress, which eventually became chronic and led to me collapsing at an airport in France on a cold February night. And that was when I think that was the sort of real burnout moment for me, a snap moment, if you will. But I didn't actually use the term burnout to describe what I'd been through for probably a few years after that, simply because of the stigma that still surrounds this term. And I think at the time I had this real perception of, everyone around me seems to be coping fine. There must be something wrong with me. So I did what every, blonde woman in their early 30s who quits their career does. I became a yoga teacher. I moved to Morocco and taught yoga and meditation retreats. But eventually I got really curious about what I'd been through, realized that it actually had been a burnout. And I thought, if I can really start to understand burnout and really get amongst, get gritty on what causes burnout, maybe I can help others avoid going through what you very accurately described as a debilitating experience for us. My own recovery took probably 1.5 years before I really started to feel that my energy levels and my resilience had returned. And that's pretty typical for a lot of people who go through burnout. So that propelled me to write a couple of books and to start to speak and, facilitate and help leaders understand what burnout is and how we can really prevent it for ourselves and each other.
So Sal, there's so much to talk about in your story and what you've just talked about there. But for me, as someone who has been fortunate enough not to have experienced it, and I know a lot of people has this question. So what's the difference? Well, lawyers, we normalize it, like the long hours, the high stress.
Totally.
For you, it was a physical collapse, you said, but how would you differentiate between what is just ongoing, the difficulties of working in a high stress, long hours occupation and genuine like clinical burnout?
It's a really great question. And in part, there's sort of 2 parts to this. One is we can use the World Health Organization definition of burnout, which they published for the first time in 2019. And that is that burnout is a syndrome that's caused by chronic workplace stress, that is stress that is ongoing, often normalized and often quite insidious in workplaces, sort of it's just the air we breathe, I think, in the law, the chronic stress. And so it really is a workplace phenomenon, according to the World Health Organization. And we use 3 dimensions to measure whether someone's in burnout. So it's not a bad day or a bad week or even a bad month. This is really debilitating exhaustion. It's a deep state of cynicism, which is characterized by withdrawal from our work, but also from life more broadly. And it's also characterized by reduced professional efficacy, which means, in simple terms, you can't do what you used to be able to do at the rate or quality that you're used to. And for those of us who attach a lot of our identity and our self-worth to our profession and our professionalism, that particular aspect of burnout can feel almost existential because we're no longer performing at that really high, really fast-paced standard. It starts to feel quite scary, and that can push us into a state of denial because we're so afraid of acknowledging that something's wrong that we really cling on as long as we possibly can before conceding that we might be in a state of burnout.
Yeah. So is there like a diagnostic process or like a doctor of burnout? I'm guessing there isn't a specialty in the medical profession for this, but
I was diagnosed by a clinical psychologist.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of, so I was in the Netherlands when I burnt out. I've also lived in the States and other countries. There's a lot of difference from one place to the next in terms of how they view burnout. When I was in Amsterdam when I went through burnout, and I was also diagnosed as being in burnout. Now that in the Netherlands, that means you can actually go on sick leave, and it's the onus is on the employer for them to return you to a state where you can work again. So it's quite heavily in onus on the employer, which is really quite unique and obviously quite distant to what we see in jurisdictions like Australia and the US. So here it's much more nebulous. I think, we can really get to that point where we see that we're in burnout, but we don't necessarily have any rights as a result of that. So it depends a lot on the kind of employer that you're working with as to what will happen if you do sort of reach that really deep state of exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced professional efficacy. And I think because the research that we did recently around burnout in the State of Workplace Burnout report showed that around 42% of Australians have all three dimensions of burnout. So that's almost half of the working population.
Wow.
I think what's sort of scary there is that it's become so normalized, the levels of stress that so many of us are under, we just don't, it's just the air we breathe at this point. We can't actually see how damaging it is until things like hospitalization occur or a collapse at an airport. And for a lot of people, we're sort of able to muddle through and push through for many, many years, really, until these kind of health issues crop up, because our bodies are really incredibly resilient. They will really cope with a lot until a breaking point is eventually reached.
I'm really interested in your definition there, which was around chronic workplace stress. Certainly one of the things, look, my ex-employer was really incredible. They were great. I think that I felt myself on a slide for a long time, and they were great in terms of, cutting back my hours and doing various things. I had also back pain, which I was trying to manage. And so, look, they were great. I can't fault them. My personal view about my burnout is that it wasn't just my employment. When I look back at the time, I was doing a lot. So I had that full-time role. I had voluntary board roles. I had a side gig business with my husband. We were renovating a house to flip. I was the mother of 2 teenagers. We had some extended family stuff going on. There was a lot going on. I don't think that my work was the only thing that contributed to my burnout. Do you think does it just have to be work, or is it everything that can combine to put you in a position like that?
Yeah, I think, and thank you so much for sharing your experience, Shayla. The reason, to my mind, that the World Health Organization characterized burnout as an occupational phenomenon is really to empower us to really focus our conversation on the impact that work has on our lives, and to really, I think, to start to drive things like regulation and legislation that really put an onus on corporations to start to treat people better and to treat them not just as resources to be exploited, but as human beings who have intrinsic value. And I think that I'm really quite pro that framing, because I think it really does help us shed a light on the often all too negative aspects or impacts that work can have on our lives. At the same time, our human body, it's one body with one nervous system, right? So all of these different forms of stress that we experience, we're not going to be able to silo into, well, that's work stress and that's family stress and that's just pandemic or general life, geopolitical stress. So we can't separate these things out. They layer on top of each other. But I do think it's important, and the way I characterize it in my books in terms of the sort of the root causes of that chronic stress that leads to burnout, there's the organizational layer, which I think does exist. And I'm glad that your employer was great. Many aren't. And it's not for want of desire on the part of leaders to create a healthy environment, but often things are just so high paced and things are so sort of, toxic already. It's very difficult to redress preventatively. But there's also the societal layer. It's how we legislate and regulate around burnout and work. But it's also about how much we have a hustle culture. How do we talk about work? Is it really normal for us to skip birthday parties or family gatherings because we're at work? How central is work to our sense of identity in our culture? But there's also a level of internalization. So I don't think, none of us are born with the idea of I have to be senior partner, or I have to, be earning this amount of money by the time I'm 35. We're not born with those ideas, but we receive them from our environment and we internalize them. And I think that kind of internalized beliefs is often what propels us towards burnout, and perhaps, to give an example, towards, crossing some of the boundaries that we might have in terms of our own health and well-being. We know that they're there. We know that we need to disconnect, but we just do this one more thing. And particularly in the context of work, that can really drive us towards that very insidious form of chronic stress that ultimately can end in complete burnout.
I mean, Kate, we've talked about this, right? The rules, that we've all internalized at some point. And
we even had to do that this week, didn't we? When I was like, Shayla, you have COVID, people understand. It's still, we're still doing it. I mean, as we often say on this pod, we don't have the answers. We're just asking the questions and learning that's why we wanted to talk about these things. But it's hard. It's so deeply entrenched, isn't it?
It really is. And I think also for example, in the legal profession, and thinking sort of specifically of lawyers, judges and other legal professionals, we have an onus towards our clients to perform at our best and to be quite dispassionate and to really work hard in a very focused way. There's a real performance aspect to being a lawyer that's very much part of the profession, and that's not inherently negative. However, I think it can sort of spill over into decisions that we make about our own health and well-being, where ultimately, if we zoom out, it's not in anyone's interests that we drive ourselves into a deep state of burnout. We can see that objectively. But when we're in chronic stress, we completely lose that objectivity. And we just keep chipping away, hoping if I hit this next deadline, once this litigation is over, et cetera, those when-if statements that ultimately just never actually happen.
Yeah, and I think I suspect it's the same across all professions, where you feel as though the work that you do is so important to another person's life. So, for example, caring professions, I suppose, doctors and other carers. You feel as though, that you have a really strong responsibility, that people are relying on you. And I think, maybe in some areas of law more than others, but particularly in litigation, where people are relying on you to be in court on a certain day or to not delay things, because actually that has a real impact on their lives. And you know already how difficult and hopeless the justice system is, and that they're having to navigate their way through that. And you don't want to add a layer of difficulty to them. So there's it's really hard, I think, to step around that. And I'm sure that, as I say, the caring professions, and there would be other professions as well, who also feel that very, very strongly. And so you just keep pushing on and choosing your clients or your patients or whoever it is instead of yourself. I'm really interested in your point I think you made, I can't remember the wording you used, sorry, around the kind of the feeling of disconnection, was it? Or around...
Ooh, yes, I love this topic. So this is...
Yeah.
Absolutely. Just to echo that, Shayla, we see it a lot also in social services and sort of any profession where people are very connected with, the fact that their client is potentially facing very difficult, very challenging circumstances. Now, I was a corporate finance lawyer. I used to joke that I made rich people richer. So it was quite, on some level, it should have been easy for me to sort of disconnect from that sense of very high sense of responsibility that I had towards my clients. But it was often because they were paying top dollar for me to be there at 3 a.m. and wait for that.
Presumably, again, not an area I've ever worked in, but presumably dealing with vast sums of money as well.
Massive, billions,
right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's definitely that high level of responsibility.
And sorry, just to add to that, I think that because the other thing that I felt very burnt out from was that layer of responsibility of not getting it wrong.
Yes.
Right? When I actually finally stepped away from all of my roles, the sense of relief that I felt about, oh my goodness, like there is actually nothing now for me to get wrong and for it to come back to me. That sense of relief was enormous. And I needed to be in that space for, it took me a couple of years really, I suppose, to be in that space. So I think, yes, it is around who it is that you're personally helping, but there's also the level of responsibility that you carry in your role is massive, I think, for burnout.
It is. And I'll come back shortly to that comment you made about the sort of withdrawal, because I think it's a really important component of burnout, but just also to highlight that absolutely that sense of not getting things wrong. I've totally experienced that too. And it even connected through to some of my core beliefs about myself that really took some work with a therapist to unpack, to sort of really, I think, get back to a healthy place where I can actually behave in a professional way that meets my clients' needs without losing myself. to the experience. And that really is, I think, that losing oneself is a really core aspect of burnout. In fact, when I was doing my research for my books and I saw, okay, we've got these three dimensions of burnout according to the World Health Organization based on some incredible, decades of research. But in my process of research and talking to so many people about their experience of burnout, one thing that came through time and again was this almost existential component to it, in part because we sense this sort of withdrawal from our work, withdrawal from life. And when we're really invested in our work for a sense of self-identity, it almost feels like there's nothing else. If I lose my career, who am I? Do I even exist anymore?
Right.
Almost. And I think that withdrawal can be incredibly terrifying. I often describe the moment that I collapsed at the airport. I was full of terror because I knew that things were going to have to change fairly fundamentally, and I was not ready for or open to that change at all. But at the same time, I felt an immense, just utter relief because I didn't have to pretend anymore. And it had taken so much energy to pretend that everything was okay. And that sort of withdrawal, I think it's one thing that can be helpful for leaders to understand, that when you're dealing with really high performers, often you may not actually see the exhaustion so much. And they're pretty good at hiding the reduced professional efficacy for a long time. They can cover mistakes. They can work a couple of extra hours to sort of make up for that, increasing decline in cognitive capacity that comes with burnout. But when you start to see them sort of lean out a little bit from work and social life as well, that can be a really strong sign and a red flag that someone's actually starting to enter into the really danger zone of chronic stress.
Yeah, I mean, the thing for me was, so I worked all of my career most of my career with very vulnerable client groups, with women experiencing violence, with refugees, with people experiencing very complex mental health issues, people experiencing homelessness. Those were my client groups. I was very invested in those client groups. I felt very strongly. I was passionate about it. And what happened to me was I didn't care anymore. And I could feel that happening, which I kind of explained away with, this is compassion fatigue, and this is what happens and it's okay. And, but I was so unable to care anymore. And that was terrifying, right? Because when you've spent your whole career caring, and I do care, obviously, I knew that I care still, but I couldn't care in a way that I just didn't have the capacity to give anymore. And that was terrifying because I just thought, oh my goodness, who am I if I'm not this? I don't even know. And I feel even emotional saying it because, I don't know how to explain it, but, objectively, intellectually, that you haven't suddenly not become a caring person. I care about people, but, I would hear stories of, women experiencing violence, and people would continue to call me because people know I'm in that space. So I would get calls sometimes. I remember about 6 months after I'd left work and I was trying to recover, in the space of 3 weeks, I had 5 people call me to ask for assistance, for friends, family, people that they knew. All I could think of was, I don't care.
Yeah.
I don't care. And I can't even tell you how terrifying that was.
Again, thank you so much for sharing that, Shayla, because I think that's such a beautiful portrayal of that's the manifestation of the cynicism aspect of burnout. And it's that, it's almost a survival tactic on the part of this incredibly wise human body that we inhabit, that in order to survive, we're shutting down systems. That can be our immune system being reduced. That can be our prefrontal cortex actually shrinking as a result of the chronic stress that we're under. But it could also be almost our heart. It's like, if I can't care anymore because I simply don't have the resources to do so. And particularly as that's such an important component of your self-identity and such an important part of, how you see yourself, then it starts to become really terrifying. And I think it's this kind of paradox of, in order to heal from burnout, we have to acknowledge that we're in it, but we push that as far down the road as we can, because what it looks like on the other side of that is simply unknown. And, I identify as a recovering control freak, that idea of that sort of, uncertainty and lack of control around what that might look like terrified me until I really had no option but to go through it.
Yeah.
Is there a gendered component to burnout? I know sort of women who are, might be the primary caregivers. They might have children. They might have aging parents. They've got a job, and there's that sort of innate sense of responsibility. I'm not to suggest that men don't experience burnout, because of course they do, but is it exacerbated by the sort of the gendered expectations that women might place on themselves or might be placed on them externally? Or I'm just really sort of interested in your sort of take on that.
Yeah. So in the annual report, so we do annual research through Infinite Potential with the State of Workplace Burnout Report. And year on year, we see that women have are experiencing higher rates of burnout than men, quite significantly in some years. And, there's a lot of talk about what that might be down to. Our research actually doesn't show a difference between burnout in caregivers and non-caregivers. Right. So there is potentially also a protective factor depending on context and sort of individual situations that may arise when we have other responsibilities. Because of course we're talking about sort of burnout in the workplace context. If we have other responsibilities that we're able to prioritize, this can actually form almost a protective factor for some people. That having been said...
Sorry, can I interrupt you? Do you mean that they look after themselves because they know that their role is a carer? So
I think two things. Firstly, they derive their identity from something more than just work. They see themselves as a parent or a caregiver to someone else. And that helps them shift their relationship with work in a way that's actually quite healthy and can potentially give rise to better boundary setting. I'm not saying that goes for everyone, but that's certainly what, one of the theories is around why there's this potentially protective factor. But it is, I think for women, and this is a generalization, this is more of my own speculation, but I think, I've had a lot of conversations also with female lawyers about this, but there's this very often a very high level, a high sense of responsibility that women have in the context of their working lives. And particularly, I remember one night, it must have been about 2:30 in the morning, and I was with 4 colleagues, we're all female associates at the time, waiting for a couple of documents to come in so that the closing the next day could take place. And someone said, I think they hire for this. We're females with extremely high levels of responsibility. We're brilliant. And we're here at 2:30 in the morning, willing to be here to wait for this document to arrive. And again, these are sort of generalizations, but I do think that there is something sort of almost insidious about this use of the high level of responsibility and wanting to support, to serve, to nourish others that can lead to perhaps a higher propensity for women to then allow that to sort of slink into chronic stress, if you will, and ultimately into burnout.
Right. I know my background's in higher education, and I certainly noticed that when it comes to the sort of the non-directly career influencing behaviors like student support, of the those kind of the stuff that is basically not research, but it seems to be predominantly women who take on that emotional labor. Again, that's just what I've noticed myself. So it's always sort of fascinated me too about, again, I don't know where it comes from, but an emotional responsibility.
Yeah, and that's one of the that's one of the things that we have found in our studies, because this year we did actually double click on the fact that, okay, there is this gender discrepancy, what's going on. And there's certainly, when we asked women, a lot of them were saying there is more emotional sort of labor that they're doing in the workplace. And that it is really difficult to push back on, because there's this kind of unspoken expectation. And if you set a boundary, then you're considered to be difficult, or you're, being... Right. It's this kind of, I think there's some culture shift that would be really helpful if we could really allow those kind of tasks, responsibilities, onuses, most of them unspoken, to start to shift and to be reallocated to be more broadly across all genders rather than just on women.
Yeah. Sorry, Kate, were you going to say something?
No. I mean, for me, that to me is what I always used to notice when it was like attending just all the stuff that isn't going to directly propel you forward to a promotion, making time to speak with students, getting involved in the sort of the student barbecue, all that kind of stuff. Of course, there were men who got involved in it. There always were, but it was the proportion that was always kind of so shocking to me.
Yeah, and I think we can characterize it a little bit as kind of, women entering the workforce in the 70s and 80s in this shift. We had already held a lot of these sort of social responsibilities. These didn't suddenly disappear when we also started to have full-time careers. And I think that's something that hasn't corrected in any way, shape or form in the interests of women and their well-being.
No, and I guess it's the same with, I can't remember where I've seen it, but about the amount of domestic labour that women traditionally, in heterosexual relationships, I'm obviously talking about a male-female partnership, but that women are still taking the bulk of the domestic load and the mental load as well.
Yeah.
So I find that really interesting. Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't have children myself, but I see so many of my female friends, particularly lawyers, who are, really completely responsible for the sort of administration of the household, and then also in a full-time career as well. And it's really, I think we really need to be talking about that more, because it is something that is just, it has also become quite normalized.
Right.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, I do coaching with people, and I see a lot of people who I feel are very close to burnout, if not already in it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that was really difficult for me, and you mentioned it before as well, is that feeling of like you're stuck and you actually can't get out. And so you just have to keep going, right? Because you can see no exit strategy. You think, and I thought about it for months. My doctors were saying to me, you need to take some time off. My psych was saying to me, you need to take some time off. I was like, yeah, look, that's just not going to happen. I can't do that. I'm going to let all these people down. There's no one else that can do this, and this. I could not orchestrate for myself an exit path.
Yep.
And of course, where that ended up is that, well, then I had to, because I just collapsed. And so I'm really interested in that idea of why it is that it's so similar for everyone. Why do we all get to that same point? And just, people, as you say, like we're control freaks often. How is it that we can't control freak our way out of this?
That's a great way to put it.
And there's a couple of really important reasons. One is that many of the root causes of burnout are far beyond our control. So these are, as I alluded to, the sort of organizational, professional, societal factors that are simply, it's just how it works, and we can't, control our way out of those. I think it's often when we're in burnout or on our way to burnout, our vision actually narrows. So we're in this stress response, right? So the body's stress response is designed to sort of deal with a once-off acute stressor, and then the parasympathetic nervous system engages and we return to rest and digest. We heal the damage that's done by stress, and we're ready to face the next stress event. So when we're in chronic stress, that means that stress response just never really ends. We're constantly on guard. We're constantly in alert. Early in that process, it can actually feel really great, because we've got all these stress hormones flowing through our body. We're kicking goals. We're smashing everything. It's all great. But that's just not, our bodies are not designed to sustain that. So at a certain point, we really start to wear down all of our systems, physiologically, emotionally, mentally. And so that also means that at the very moment when we probably most need to be prioritizing our health and well-being, we're incapable of it, because we don't have the objectivity any longer. We're simply in the stress. This is where working with a coach and a therapist can be so empowering and so impactful, because they often will help us get to a point where we start to see what, in a safe space, what we can't actually admit to ourselves. So I think that's a really important component of it. And also I think to understand, I think we have this idea often that to go from where we are now to sort of health and well-being is going to take some massive radical reset. We have to start from scratch, have to push everything off the table and really start from ground zero. But I think if you have any capacity whatsoever to start to make micro shifts in your day-to-day behaviors and your habits in terms of how you fiercely prioritize your own health and well-being, you can actually track to a healthier place and track away from the trajectory towards burnout through really having that consistency in looking after yourself in a very considered, intentional way. And I have a couple of frameworks that I use with people to sort of map what that looks like. But it really does require, I call it a mindset shift, but I think there's almost a heart shift as well, because it has to come from a place where we fiercely value ourselves merely for our own existence. It's not contingent on that next promotion, on getting that deal done, on being everything to everyone. We really have to come to a place of self-compassion and self-love. And that has to be the reason that we make these shifts towards improved self-knowledge, self-awareness, and also improved self-care.
Yeah. And look, and I think, the idea of an outlaw for Kate and I is that, you step out of that normal script. And so I think looking after yourself, deciding that you're going to look after yourself, to us, I think is outlaw behavior. And I do really want to come to some practical ideas, I guess, that people can implement. But I just want to take one step further back, going back to my question around, I see a lot of people who I think are on the verge of burnout, maybe already even in it. I'd love to just talk about maybe how it is that you felt in the lead up, and I'm happy to share as well, to give some idea of maybe if people start to see some of those things they should be red flags, and it shouldn't be that you're just pushing them under the carpet and, oh, it's just I'm stressed and actually next week it'll be okay because next week, this will stop and that will stop. And there's always every week, isn't it? Like everyone thinks everything's going to be better next week. It never comes. So I'd love to hear about, what you think might have been some of your kind of early warning signs.
Yeah. So there's no sort of fixed list of symptoms that we can say, if you have these, you're in burnout or you're on your way to burnout. What I experienced were really severe headaches, quite significant sleep issues, so difficulty getting to sleep and staying asleep. I became quite moody and irritable. There are a couple of standout moments that I remember in particular with my partner at the time where I immediately recognized, oh my God, this isn't who I truly am. But I was just too stressed and too tired to really address that. So there was also, I really withdrew from a lot of social relationships. So my friendships really started to dwindle and I was getting, stress rashes. I was losing weight and I was just felt disconnected. I used to describe it as I'm living through glass. I'm not actually fully present in my life. And I think that's something that I have heard from quite a lot of women who've been through burnout, that there is this kind of sense of disconnect. And I think that withdrawal or cynicism that we spoke to earlier, those were the kind of key ones in the lead up for me. And I think whenever someone said, hey, maybe you're working too much or maybe you want to dial that down, I would bite their heads off and tell them that they didn't understand corporate law and march, soldier on towards that collapse moment, which actually ultimately really saved me. So those are a few of my the red flags that I've completely ignored. I'm curious to hear yours, Shayla.
So I think sleep was definitely the one for me. So, I would be exhausted, but my quality of sleep was dire. And I would wake up at 2:00 in the morning thinking of 10 other things that I should have done, and quite often would just get up and do it in the hope that would then mean that I could stop thinking about it and go back to sleep, but quite often I wouldn't. So my sleep was really terrible. I definitely withdrew from social things. So social things began to feel like just another thing that I had to fit in. And also I think I've been reflecting on this actually over the past 6 months. And so I feel like it's taken me around about 2 years to get over it. And it's probably only the past 6 months where I've maybe begun to feel like my old self again. So it's been quite a long time. But one of the things I've realized over this past 6 months is that I did retreat back into myself a lot. So going out to places was just, felt like too much. Didn't really want to do that. Happy to kind of see friends in small environments, but going out to big things wasn't something that I really enjoyed doing. And I actually noticed I love colour, as you can see. I feel like I didn't wear colour for 2 years. So there was something about it that made me, I've been reflecting upon the fact that I think it made me kind of, I don't know, cocoon in on myself maybe. Yep. I wore a lot of black. I just used to kind of hide. I didn't want to be in the spotlight anywhere. It was, so I guess, just an overall withdrawal, I think, was the thing for me. I felt like I could never have conversations with people where I was really invested in the conversation because I just didn't have any headspace.
Yeah.
Just didn't have any headspace.
I think that's one of the key things. I'm really glad you highlight that, Shayla, because what we often see is this kind of vicious cycle with burnout where we start to experience the symptoms, and particularly if we have any kind of self-sufficiency mentality or I have to do everything by myself, I can't ask for help, we start to cycle into this, I'm going to withdraw, I don't want to tell anyone about this, perhaps there's some shame looped in there as well, and that can just get us to the point where we almost completely shut down. And even when, well-intended friends are sort of trying to reach out and penetrate through that little cocoon that we've built for ourselves, we simply don't have the energy, the resources, or even the capacity to really connect with them in that state.
If someone you're talking about the sort of the very real physical issues, but I think a lot of people would fear that sort of admitting to the term burnout would harm their career prospects sort of going forward. So how did you manage that, Sally, and also Shayla? But how did you manage that concern? You were both in positions where you had to step back, you had to stop, your bodies were making you stop. But how did you manage, like the reputational concerns, those professional concerns, confidentiality around these issues? Like, what was that like for you?
For me personally, Kate, I was at a point where I was ready to burn it all down, and I kind of did. I had one session with a coach who told me, almost the first thing that he said was, now whether you want to leave Alan and Overy or not. And I immediately thought, oh my God, I have options. I can leave. And I knew I wanted to.
Yeah.
And I did. And one of my journeys through, coaching and speaking to a lot of people, having this experience, but do want to stay in their profession. And I'm so glad that they do, because we need amazing people to be lawyers. But it is about sort of navigating that path with confidence. It's something that it depends so much on your culture, on your direct leader, and on the sort of support available for how you're able to navigate that. But I have seen some really beautiful success stories where people do acknowledge that they've gone through a difficult phase, and they really frame it. I think this is really important, that they frame it as something that I'm doing this, I'm looking after myself, not just for myself, in fact, for my clients, for this firm. This is something that we need to talk about. And often it's having that little bit of courage, particularly in a profession where these kind of conversations are not necessarily welcomed, but that can really start to shift culture and to really take the pressure off, particularly younger lawyers who feel like they have absolutely no capacity to admit any kind of weakness whatsoever. But yeah, it is something that's certainly sensitive in terms of reputational damage. And I do think that it keeps a lot of lawyers to this day silent in suffering.
I think for me, Kate, I was so exhausted that I didn't care initially.
Right.
I couldn't gather the energy to care. I remember when I called my boss and said, I need to take 6 months off. I said it crying. I could barely speak, but, I said it, and she said, okay. And I said, I can't even tell the staff. I can't tell the staff. Like, I just, I got nothing. And she said, it's fine. I'll tell the staff. What do you want me to tell them? And I said, tell them whatever you want. I don't care. Just tell them. And because, there was such a relief in that moment that I'd kind of finally given up. And so, look, I do not recommend doing it like I did. There was 50 better ways to do it. Not getting to that point and having some control over the story is my first recommendation. So that's why I was really keen to talk about, like, what are these kind of, early signs, I suppose, because when you get to the point that I got to, and maybe like Sally got to, is you do lose control over all of that. It's way easier, I think, to be able to craft a story and, save your reputation in terms of, I do need to take a break. I've got some health issues. You don't need to say what the health issues are, taking some personal time for whatever it is that it happens to be. Whereas when you, like me, go to work one day and then just don't turn up the next, it's pretty obvious, that something's kind of gone on, maybe that looks like burnout. So I think that, I'm just such an advocate now for people to recognise the signs early and to take steps early. One, hopefully to reverse where they are so they can try and be in a place where they can work more sustainably and not get to that point. But if you are at that point, of which there's no shame, then really being able to take the time out. But yeah, craft the message in a way that feels comfortable for you. And all workplaces, as I say, I was very lucky. I had a great workplace, but all workplaces are going to be a bit different about that. There's going to be a whole heap of prejudices in some workplaces that are going to be really difficult to get past. But do you know what? I think that, and I've thought about this, talking about your burnout, of course, there's a reputational risk. Maybe it has harmed my future employment prospects. I don't know. But I've thought about that in terms of, well, if it has, did I really want to work at those places anyway?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that came out of sort of my post-burnout growth was really identifying my core values. And I knew that in order to live authentically, I was going to have to be vulnerable about my story and share it, because that actually became my mission. And I think it's important that we have people who, remain in the profession. I think what you spoke to really beautifully as well, Shayla, is that it really is about prevention. Curing, recovering from burnout is really difficult. We've both been there. It is intense. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. And I've coached a lot of people through it for whom it's agonizing to lose this sense of identity, ultimately to rebuild it and to grow from it. But the process itself, I wouldn't wish on anyone. And so this is where I've designed a couple of frameworks that can help people. And I think the one that's probably might be most helpful for your listeners is the BRNT model. So this is the word burnout with the vowels removed. And it's really a framework that we can use both from a prevention and a recovery perspective. The B stands for breathe. So this is really about connecting with your parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest system. We do it every single time we exhale. So that's why breath work can be powerful, yoga, movement. And, I'm not going to say that doing a breathing exercise will prevent or cure your burnout. That's definitely not the case. But really consciously building in breath, yoga, meditation, and movement, your favorite form of exercise, and fiercely prioritizing that in the day-to-day. The R is for rest. And so this is really about making sure you have healthy sleep hygiene. It's also about building in breaks during the day, in between meetings, disconnecting at lunch, disconnecting in the evenings, and disconnecting weekends and vacations. I know this is a stumbling block for many, but particularly for leaders, I'd really encourage you to look at where you can build in those breaks, partly because there's a legislative requirement to do so these days in Australia, but also partly because it actually drives better results, better creativity, and better performance from your teams. The N is for nourish. And this is not just what we eat, but it's really about everything that we consume. So news media, social media, the people that we surround ourselves with, the environment that we live in, really being very mindful and intentional about what you consume at all levels. And finally, and this is the most important one, and we've touched on this, T is for talk. And we have a tendency, I think, particularly in the legal profession, to stiff up our lip, just, soldier on, march through. We really need to build strong social connections and have people with whom we can be vulnerable. These kind of connections are best built when we're in a good spot. So if you're feeling great, take the time now to really focus on, nourishing those friendships and having even just a few people that you can connect with and really very openly debrief with how things are going. Because if we don't acknowledge what's happening, we can't change it. So we really need to have those safe spaces for acknowledging, for talking about what we're going through, so that we can really make healthy choices to track away from burnout and towards a thriving and sustainable career.
Right. And also too, I'm conscious when you're saying talk too, like getting in touch with a psychologist or a coach or someone who can help you unpack it. I've found that coaching or a psych assistance with a psych, whenever I've been going through things, just it gets it out of your head.
Yep.
And it's almost essential. Like you get it out of your head, you're talking it through, you put it on the table, and then it's much easier with that third party assistance to look at it a bit more objectively.
I couldn't agree more, Kate. I think it's, it's third party, it's professional, it's what they're trained to do. You're paying them, so there's not that sort of, tension of a friendship or a partner relationship in there as well. Often friends and partners are so worried about us as well that it makes it difficult for them to sort of navigate that process objectively, because they just want us to be better. Whereas a professional gets it, knows it inside out, and can really, I think of it the same as having, I've had 2 knee surgeries. I wouldn't do that myself. I would also not expect myself to psychologize myself out of a burnout. And I think having those professional partners is absolutely essential. And again, from a preventative, if you think you're not in burnout, that is awesome. But, working with a therapist, I think, can benefit pretty much every single person on this planet. And it's
100%. Yes. Hard agree.
Yeah, I hard agree as well. And people say to me that I talk about mental health a lot, and I don't know if that's just because I was the CEO of the Mental Health Law Centre and I got used to talking about mental health a lot, but I talk about my own personal mental health a lot. And a friend of mine was going through a bit of a hard patch, and I suggested she go and see a psychologist, and she went and saw one and, found it super useful. And I said, well, you should just go once a month. Yep. You don't have to be unwell to go and see a psychologist. Right. It's actually, I think it's a very good kind of mental health hygiene almost, to go and see someone on a regular basis.
Absolutely, Shelley. I mean, we all have mental health at all times, right? And sometimes our mental health is in great shape. That's great. But I think having that regular touch point can actually surface some conversations that you might not get to when you're in crisis, but that are actually really informing around that personal growth, that ongoing journey towards deeper authenticity, fulfillment, and, really making sure that you're living the best possible life you can. So I hard agree with both of you on that one too.
Yeah. Well, this has been so interesting. I mean, I could talk to you for hours about this, Sally, obviously, but thanks so much for joining us today. Is there anything else you wanted to ask, Kate?
No, I can only say the work you're doing is so important. I'm so sorry you had to go through what you had to go through to get there, Sally, but this is such an important conversation. And so you're obviously the person to do it because your work is really resonating.
Look, it's my pleasure, Kate. And sometimes I do, I'm really grateful for the experience that I had, because sometimes I wonder maybe if I'd been in a less stressful environment, would I have had gone through burnout? I wouldn't be here without that. And I love my life today. And I'm really grateful to be where I am. And I just, when I speak, when I'm, speaking with your listeners now, if there's even one person for whom this has resonated and for whom this helps them, empowers them to make even a slight change in their lives that helps them avoid burnout, then I'm so thrilled by that idea. So thank you so much for having me today.
No, it's absolutely our pleasure.
Yeah, thank you again, Sally. Really great. I don't know about you, Kate, but I found that a thoroughly interesting conversation.
Absolutely. Really powerful information. I really enjoyed it.
One of the things that we didn't get to talk about, I don't think, was the fact that people who work less have lower rates of burnout, which of course is maybe pretty obvious, but that was in her report. We will share her report in the show notes. But the other exciting news that we have is that because our Backwards Budget episode was one of our very best episodes, and some people have been saying to us that they hate spreadsheets almost as much as Kate does, but that they want to have a budget and they've asked for a bit of help. So we've made a very exciting decision, and we're going to do a live Facebook workshop on the 25th of July at 12 o'clock Western Standard Time. If you're in the east coast of Australia, that's 2 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. Yeah, if you'd like to join us, you need to join the Facebook group. The link is on the website. And yeah, come along, and we're going to go through the spreadsheet and just help people fill it out so that it doesn't feel quite so overwhelming. Otherwise, of course, you can keep in touch with us on LinkedIn, on Instagram, and on Facebook. Send us an email, keep in touch however you want, sign up for our newsletter. Anything I've forgotten in that little spiel of promo?
I think you brought big CEO energy to this and thought of everything.
All right, well, have a great week, Kate. See you next week.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.